Welcome to this week's episode of Stranger Stitches. The date is November 24th, 1946. The high temperature is 38 degrees, the low is 31. Cold as hell for a birthday. Eleanor Louise Cowell gave birth to a little boy at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. She named him Theodore Robert Cowell. So this kid is a Sagittarius. You know those fire signs, adventurous, free-spirited, do what they want, go where they want, go where the wind takes them, and it makes them fun to be around. Usually. But this little kid was subject to a shit show right out of the chute, messed up right from the start. Louise initially left her newborn at the home for adoption, but just after a very short time, she came back for him. I mean, like, less than 2 weeks, certainly. Maybe her parents influenced her, or maybe she just couldn't do it. She never said. But she picked up the kiddo, and they all headed back to her parents' house in Philadelphia. And let me tell y'all, this house was nothing to brag about. Ted's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was a violent, tyrannical asshole and a big-time racist to boot. I found one source that said he joined the military on October 24th, 1918, and was released the 3rd of December, 1918. Very short time in the military. Now, I didn't read too much into that. The war was over, and they just didn't need him, so it sounds like he signed up just in time to be released. But this guy ruled his roost with an iron fist and kept everyone in the household walking on eggshells. Here's a real fucked up part. Teddy wasn't scared of the violence. He was drawn to it. He later said that he identified and respected and looked up to Samuel. Let's noodle that out for a second. This little kid saw his grandfather's brutality and thought, yeah, that's what a man looks like. That's the way you get things done. How you make things go your way. And I'm telling you folks, that ain't normal. And Ted's grandmother, bless her heart, she was described as timid, obedient, and beaten down. That makes sense when you're living with a piece of work like Samuel. She was so depressed that she regularly got electroconvulsive therapy. Picture this little boy knows what his grandmother is going through, knows that she's getting her brain zapped because she can't cope with the hell she's living in. It seems like these things weren't kept secret from Ted. He knew what was going on. But women back then didn't have a whole lot of choices. I'm sure she was doing what she was doing to get through. Aunt Julia, little Auntie Julia, said this kid was a bad seed from day one. Once she woke up with knives having been placed, slid underneath her body so that when she rolled over, she'd either get cut or stabbed. Ted was 3 years old, standing over her, grinning like a fool on Christmas morning, and he was every bit of 3 years old. Here's some important context that explains a lot about Ted's fucked up psychology. During his childhood, Ted was being raised believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother Louise was his older sister. I hear that was more common than we think back in the 40s and 50s due to the massive stigma around being a single parent. Families would go to great lengths to hide illegitimate births, even if it meant screwing with that kid's head for years. Think about what this does to a child's mind. Ted spent his early years calling his actual mother a sister and believing the violent, racist asshole Samuel was his father. He was living in a fantasy and not a good one. That kind of fundamental lie about your own identity is going to mess with your head in ways that aren't going to heal. There are different stories about how and when Ted learned the truth, and honestly, that's part of what made it so damaging. Some say he accidentally came across his birth certificate while going through some other papers. Others claim that a cousin got pissed off and called him a bastard, told him what it actually meant, and told him he could find proof on his birth certificate. There's even a story that Ted suspected something was off and went digging for himself. Ann Rule, the crime writer who actually knew Ted, believed that he figured it out around 1969 when he was actively searching for his birth records and probably trying to find out who his father was. But he was already in his 20s by then, and as I go through his timeline, I believe that he knew long before then. Maybe it was something his household just didn't talk about. It's like, something we keep private and just for people in the house. Ted himself gave conflicting accounts over the years. Sometimes he'd say he just grew up knowing that something wasn't right. Other times he'd act like it was a complete shock. I think he was going through his own timeline and, making up the narrative to suit what he needed to say at the time. So did he confront his family and get more lies? Either way, it planted seeds of doubt about everything he'd been told all his life. Ted had always resented his mother for not telling the truth, so y'all lean in and let's get scandalous. Louise might not have known. If Ted was conceived during an assault, Louise would have been blamed for bringing it on herself because those were the times that she lived in. Was your skirt too tight, your lipstick too red, your heels too high? Did you wear those sinful dangly earrings? You see what I'm saying? It was a whole era of victim blaming, especially when any type of sexual assault was concerned. Conversely, if she had been keeping company with a couple of different gentlemen, she would have had to keep that to herself as well. Either way, she might not have known the identity of Daddy most likely, and she couldn't tell what she didn't know. But that can leave some scars that won't heal, and that brings us to the biggest mystery of this chapter, the mystery of Ted's real dad. So we've been through it. The birth certificate just says unknown, which chewed at him for his whole life. Marshall Lloyd was a name that got kicked around. Ann Rule, again, says that his birth certificate listed the Air Force vet and salesman's name, but you can't have it both ways, Ann. Daddy was never named. Another name that was thrown in the hat was Jack Worthington. Some journalists claimed that Louise told them that this, another war veteran, and he had seduced her right out of high school. Well, let's noodle this one out, too. Maybe not Louise. Louise was 22 years old when Ted was born. If she had had an ongoing affair with this man, she would have had to keep it a secret for 4 years. This wasn't right out of high school. Just something to think about. Either way, Louise was keeping her secrets. Samuel Cowell. Now that is a real disturbing one. That said that Ted's grandfather might have been his actual father, but thank you, Jesus, a 2020 DNA test proved that that was not the case. So now it's time to bust a big move and meet Uncle John. In 1950, when Ted was about 4 years old, some family members basically held an intervention with Louise, and they told her, get the hell out of here and go make a fresh start. The toxic environment in Philadelphia with Samuel's violence and the family's dysfunction was no way to raise a kid, and it was eating him up alive. So Louise made a brave decision, packed up little Ted, moved clear across the country to Tacoma, Washington, to go live with her Uncle John, who had invited her. Now, this move was like going from hell to heaven for little Ted. At least initially, Uncle John was everything that Ted's grandfather Samuel was not. John was a music professor at the College of Puget Sound, a man of genuine culture and refinement. Where Samuel ruled through fear and violence, Uncle John represented intellect, sophistication, and class. But it also seems like little Ted was just glomming on to any male figure he could find. So picture this. A little boy who'd spent his early years watching his grandfather terrorize the family suddenly finds himself in a house filled with classical music, books, and intelligent conversation. Uncle John's gleaming dark piano was one of Ted's first and most fond memories. The kid would sit there and be mesmerized by the music, soaking up this world of cultivation and learning. John was only a few years older than Louise, so more like an older brother than a traditional uncle figure, but he became Ted's first real male role model that wasn't a complete piece of shit. Ted latched onto him like we were talking about and immediately made the conscious decision to try to pattern himself a little more like Uncle John, and this explains so much about Ted's later obsession with appearing educated, sophisticated, and cultured. But Ted didn't just adopt John's love of culture. He developed a superiority complex that would follow him for the rest of his life. He began to hate anything that seemed common or blue-collar, anything that seemed ugly and raw to him. He just couldn't take it. He was above all that. The working class people of Tacoma, the mill workers and the regular folks just making a day-to-day living, Ted saw them as beneath him, and the attitude wasn't just snobbery. It was tied to something much deeper and much more dangerous. The world owed him something, and he could take it any time he wanted. So you're starting to see the psychological foundation for the demon Ted would later become. His attitude was rooted in self-doubt. He knew he came from nothing. He knew that he was illegitimate, and his real origins were shameful. So he overcompensated by convincing himself that he was special and deserved so much better. In his mind, he should have been born into wealth and privilege, should have had the finest education, should have been naturally superior to everyone around him, but the reality didn't match his fantasy, and he got hella resentful. He believed that he could be justified in taking anything he wanted, including lives. He would manipulate, charm, and ultimately destroy people because in his mind he was owed their attention, their bodies, and their very existence. Uncle John probably had no idea what his influence would help create in the sense of entitlement in Ted, the culture and refinement that should have made this boy a civilized human being. Instead, fed his narcissism, gave him the framework to look down on others. This is not what Uncle John intended Ted to learn. Even when he had to work some minimum wage jobs and struggled at school, he maintained his air of superiority. He looked down on other people for being working class. He dismissed his coworkers as beneath him and constantly presented himself as a more sophisticated person than he actually was. Just falling on hard times for a minute. I'll be shed of y'all soon enough. It's really sick when you think about it. Let's go meet Johnny Bundy. Louise met a man named Johnny Culpepper Bundy, and she had finally gotten herself a genuinely decent man. Johnny was well aware that Ted was Louise's son from a previous relationship, and instead of seeing this as baggage, Johnny stepped up to the plate. He legally adopted Ted and gave him the Bundy surname, trying to create a stable family unit for a traumatized kid. And yes, you heard it. This is our Ted Bundy. Here's the thing that pisses me off. Johnny Bundy was exactly the kind of father figure Ted needed. This was a working class guy with a good heart, genuinely wanted to be a dad to this kid. Johnny made real efforts to include Ted in family activities, took him camping, tried to teach him practical skills, and showed him what normal, nonviolent households look like. What was the response? Ted's rejection. He wasn't having none of it. From day one, this entitled little prick kept Johnny at an emotional arm's distance. Instead of gratitude, Ted showed nothing but cold disdain for Johnny's effort, and it gets worse. Later, when Ted was in college and dating, he would talk trash about Johnny to his friends. He'd tell them that Johnny wasn't very bright, didn't make much money, like these were character flaws instead of just the reality of being a working-class American, providing for your family. Charming little shit, wasn't he? Here's a man who stepped up to be the father when someone else's kid wasn't claimed. And this is how he's repaid, treating him like dirt. And this wasn't just your garden variety teenage rebellion. In Ted's twisted little mind, Johnny did not have enough achievements or education to be worthy of respect. He wasn't smart enough, refined enough, or successful enough to meet Ted's ridiculous standards. And I'm going to tell you the truth, Ted wasn't meeting them either. Now, Uncle John had only intended to imbue him with the positive nature of an academic life. He wasn't meant to cause any of this. This is something that Ted has cooked up in his own horrifying little mind. If that wasn't enough, Ted would deliberately provoke Johnny. Friends and family had seen this. Ted being intentionally disrespectful in front of people, knowing that Johnny wouldn't bite back. And acting like the man who was trying to be his father was somehow very far beneath him. Johnny, to his credit, kept trying. He did get frustrated. What man wouldn't dealing with this ungrateful little brat? But he never gave up. He kept trying to make an effort to connect and to be a positive influence, to show Ted what healthy masculinity looked like. And I don't think they had those kind of words for it back then. He was just trying to get him to straighten up and fly right. He explained to people that Johnny wasn't his real father, and somehow poverty wasn't contagious, and there was no way Ted was going to catch it. And later in life, talk about hypocrisy, when Ted wanted to present himself as well-adjusted and a normal guy, he would completely flip the script. He would go around telling people he came from a loving family with kind and caring parents. Pure bullshit, of course. Bullshit served by the shovel. But it was for the purpose of him creating a narrative that suited the purposes that he needed to fill at the time. Are we seeing this as a tragically missed opportunity that could have been a healing relationship? He could have learned humility and gratitude. He could have learned how to be a decent man, work hard, be loyal, and put family first. He could have learned respect, and he could have learned a whole lot of other things. But do we believe that it was already in Ted's DNA to be a shit? Johnny tried, but you can only go so far. If the kid isn't receptive, what are you going to do? Ted had taken his only chance and just threw it out the window. Well, that's up for y'all to decide. Well, time rolls on, and Louise and Johnny have 3 kids together. Ted found himself with some half-siblings. His sisters are alive and well, and they don't talk about it at all, ever. And I can't blame them. They have earned some well-deserved privacy. But his brother, Rich, was willing to speak up, and he had some chilling stories to tell. Richard, but he goes by Rich, described having this vulnerability and big trust when it came to Ted. They had what Rich called a very intense relationship. Rich would go visit Ted in Utah. When Ted went up there for law school, they would go camping. And one of the trips got cut short just out of nowhere. And he sent me home early, Rich said. It was really upsetting because it was out of the clear blue. The really chilling part, when they were waiting at the airport for the flight, Rich noticed that Ted's face looked like he was visualizing something horrifying and disgusting. It makes you wonder what was on Ted's mind at the moment. A friend says that they remembered how Ted just adored Richard. He was always wanting to take him places and doing things. This is twisted because Ted could show genuine affection while secretly being a monster on the side. Makes you wonder about those campsites, doesn't it? Were they related to his other activities? Was he taking his little brother near the places where he dumped bodies or hunted women? It gives you the shivers, doesn't it? Was he looking to lure women? You know, a man with a kid, a woman is definitely willing to help. Nothing sexier than a good dad, right? Well, Rich still struggles with that betrayal, having looked up to someone who turned out to be this hideous thing. He said, his words, "Part of me was blocking it out. Dude, whatever it is, you can't do nothing about it. Don't let it ruin your life." Another part of his consciousness was saying that try to protect yourself. And man, just go outside and ride your skateboard. Fuck him. I guess at that point, there's all you can say. For outward appearances, Ted was a bright, well-adjusted young man destined for big things. But what he became was one of America's most notorious serial killers. It is said that he was attractive, and I beg to differ. I think he looks a little weaselly, but that might just be my own taste. It is said that he was smart. I disagree again. He had the gift of gab, and he could speak superficially on a whole bunch of topics, and that made him seem a little brighter than he was. What I will give him, and I agree with, was that he was charismatic. Yeah, and all of this was superficial, though. He was claiming himself to be an aspiring lawyer who dabbled in politics and worked at a suicide hotline. I believe the part about the suicide hotline that is provable, and that is where he met his friend and future true crime writer Ann Rule. His co-workers described him as kind, charming, and empathetic, the perfect cover for what he really was. But here's what I think, and y'all are going to get a lot of my opinions in here, but I will state that they are my opinions. He was a control freak who got off on inserting himself into the bigger picture, and that's what made him dangerous. He looked like the kind of guy you'd want to date. He acted like someone you could trust, all while planning the most horrific things anyone could ever imagine. And don't imagine that. Don't let your brain go there. Let's talk a little bit about how this psychopath actually pulled off his killing spree for so long. Ted Bundy wasn't just some rando guy that snapped one day. This was cold, calculated. He was a predator who turned manipulation into an art form. Here's the thing that oh my gosh, he's terrifying. There's no other word for it. He is terrifying. He was charming as hell. And we're talking about a guy who could walk into the room of people and have meaningful conversations within minutes. But that charm, it was all fake. Every single bit of it was designed to get you into a place of trust so he could hurt you. He could have written the con artist playbook. And this whole bag of tricks, he'd pretend to be a cop, a firefighter, or whatever authority figure would make you feel safe. He'd say things like, "Ma'am, you need to come with me," and the people would actually go. He'd also fake injuries, hobbling around on crutches or putting on a fake cast, playing the helpless guy who needed assistance with his boat or his car. Classic predator move. Make yourself look harmless and vulnerable so your victim wants to help you. There was one incident that I read about where he had a canoe on top of his car, and he had a fake cast on his arm, and he asked this young lady who was coming by his car, "Can you help me get the boat down?" Now, I would have seen it, and I know you would have too, but I'm going to help you get this boat down. How the hell you going to row it with a busted arm? You know, I don't know if I'd have helped him. I'd say something like, "You know, you really ought to stay out of the water. You don't want to get that cast wet." But those were simpler times. The asshole was good looking by the standards of the day, and he knew it, but it wasn't just his looks. He was a whole package. He would remember every little detail about conversation, so when he talked to you, it felt like you were the most important person in the world. He'd do small favors, be a perfect gentleman, all while planning how he was going to take your body apart. It really sick when you think about it. Have you seen any interviews with Ted Bundy? He had this look that he'd give, and it really gets under my skin. He had this intense stare that people talked about it was not nervous or shifty or any look that you would expect from a killer, but it was unnerving, a penetrating gaze that made him seem confident and in control. He used it to size up people, find their weak spots. It wasn't just someone looking at you, it was someone looking into you. Now, too much eye contact can be perceived as staring, which can make people uncomfortable or intimidated, perceived as rude or even aggressive. Eye contact is generally a sign of attentiveness and engagement, but holding someone's gaze for too long can be just rude. In his case, it is an attempt at intimidation. He likes to stare the other person down and make them blink first. It's a small way of him establishing some dominance. But once Bundy got his victims alone, that nice guy act was all over. He preferred to knock his victims out, knock them unconscious with a blunt object, crowbar, tire iron, whatever was handy. And he always made sure that he had one of these objects ready to hand. He would strangle them, usually with some kind of ligature. He avoided guns because they were too loud. They drew too much attention, and they leave ballistic evidence. This little fucker was thinking about forensics while he was planning on murdering people. Then there was the after-death shit. If y'all are squeamish, tune me out for about 15 seconds and come back, because it's disturbing. Bundy didn't just kill these women, he kept their bodies. He would go back to where he dumped them, and I can't barely say this, he would have relations with the corpses for sometimes a long time, until they decomposed too much to be of any use to him. He kept severed heads in his apartment looking like fucking trophies. He'd wash their hair, put makeup on them. This is beyond. Yeah. He also broke into some homes and attacked women while they slept. In Utah, he'd recreate scenes that he read about in crime magazines with his victims before killing them. His apartment was like a sick theater to his own fantasies. Now, he's smart about his forensics, but this really pisses me off. He was also smart about not getting caught. He never left evidence at crime scenes. He'd change his appearance, grow a beard, shave a beard, grow his hair, cut his hair, change his style, gain some weight, lose some weight, anything you need to do. He had a distinctive birthmark on the side of his neck that he would cover up with turtlenecks, and wasn't it a thing at the time, a turtleneck and a sport coat? That was the height of fashion. And get this, he was paying attention to what the cops were doing. He was his own biggest fan. He would read about their investigation techniques in the newspaper. He'd watch the news, several newspapers, and he adapted his methodology accordingly. This guy had at least two sides to his personality. He referred to the killer side as the entity. Have y'all watched Dexter? Yeah, Dexter referred to his killer side as the dark passenger. I wonder if the Dexter writers got that from Ted Bundy. And to everyone else, he was just Ted. Law student, political volunteer, nice guy that worked at a suicide hotline. But inside, he was a monster who saw other people as objects to be used and discarded. Here's another one of my opinions about the suicide hotline. He had control. He was very much in control. He could control if you lived or if you died. He would help people on the suicide hotline earnestly. I believe he was sincere when he was doing this. He would help that person, talk them down off a ledge and help them live. And then he would go out and kill somebody else. He had the ultimate control. In 1967, Diane Edwards became Ted Bundy's first serious girlfriend. They met at the University of Washington. Bundy later said, "She was the only woman I ever really loved." Diane came from a wealthy family in California, but she ended their relationship in '68 due to Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. This breakup is said to have greatly impacted Bundy. He later stated that the relationship with Diane had a lasting impact on him. He also described superficial attributes. She was a hottie, and I know this is real twisted, but he went on to kill women that looked a whole lot like her. Not always, but most cases, they did look a whole lot like Diane. In the summer of 1971, we have the Joyce LePage murder. This is a case from '71 that some folks tried to pin on Ted, but I'm telling you, this doesn't add up. It doesn't make much sense. Joyce LePage was a sweet college girl at Washington State University who got murdered in her dorm. Her family says she loved to write and probably would have gone on to be a teacher if some bastard hadn't cut her life short. Her brother Bruce has been fighting for justice for decades. As of 2018, he was offering up a $100,000 reward for any information. She was a very friendly, outgoing girl, he says, and I'm not giving up. But here's the deal. The only reason anyone connects Ted to this murder is because Joyce was a pretty college girl. That's that. When you look at the facts, it really doesn't add up. Ted says his killing didn't start until '72. Yeah, and Joyce was stabbed to death. Ted says he hated knives, but we'll see that that wasn't always true. But back in the beginning, when he was just learning his craft, he could have played with a couple different methods. Plus, she was found 5 hours from Seattle, where Ted lived. His early attacks were close to home, where he could stalk the women in his neighborhood. The cop who worked this case for 26 years said, "My gut feeling is that this was someone she knew. Makes more sense than Ted driving 5 hours to kill a stranger and then driving 5 hours back." And may I add, regarding Joyce, her remains were found about 9 to 10 months after her killing. And yeah, the body dump doesn't match either. She was found in a gully, in a ditch, in the remote Way Canyon. Her mostly skeletal remains were wrapped inside a military blanket and then in a green carpet. The carpet had gone missing about 10 days before she was reported missing, and this was from the Stevens Hall at the university, which was under construction at the time. So that would have given Bundy to have to make 2 trips, one to retrieve the carpet, and then 2 to go do the deed. So yeah, for all the ones he did do, I'm kind of giving Bundy a bye on this one. I wish we knew who did it. But I can't, in my mind, pin this one on him. In 1972, Ted Bundy gets his act together, if only for a little while. After bouncing around to different schools like a damn ping pong ball, Ted finally got it together, went back to the University of Washington, majored in psychology, and actually graduated for once. And this is when he goes to work at the suicide hotline. Yeah, he already had a degree in psychology, so he could really take someone's brain out and play with it. That's really creepy. Ted wanted to go to a fancy law school because, prestige was everything to him. But his LSAT scores, were about as impressive as dry toast. He wasn't going anywhere covered in ivy. So he had to settle for night classes at the University of Puget Sound. He had to carpool with other students, and Ted was not proud of that. He always thought he was better than everybody else, but here he was stuck. Yeah, stuck doing things common people have to do. In 1973, the killing begins. Bundy reconnected with Diane Edwards and made himself appear successful and driven. They even discussed marriage. However, in January of 74, Bundy stopped contacting Diane without any explanation. She later believed that Ted had manipulated her to fall in love with him again so he could reject her, mirroring her actions of years before, because he had to have the last word. Nobody dumps him. Nobody. Some researchers do say that Bundy's victims resembled Diane Edwards, often being young, long dark hair parted down the center. Not all victims do, but a lot of them did. This is where shit gets real. Ted started working for Washington Governor Daniel Evans' re-election campaign and got appointed to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. The irony is freaking sickening. By 73, he got into the University of Law School, but that was only because Governor Evans had put in a good word for him. But Ted dropped out about a year later. You know, he could not stick with anything when the real work got started. Around this time, it's believed that the murders began in earnest, though he wouldn't go full monster mode until 74. This is when Bundy transformed from a wannabe law student until a serial killer. 74 was the year he stopped fantasizing and made it real. January 4th, Karen Sparks, age 18, was bludgeoned and assaulted in her Seattle apartment while she slept. Ted broke into her basement bedroom, beat her unconscious with a metal rod from her bed frame. She survived, but with permanent damage that left her unable to speak properly for months. This was Ted's first established victim, and he set his pattern, attacking sleeping women in their homes with blunt instruments. February 1st, Linda Ann Healy, age 21, was abducted from her basement bedroom after being beaten unconscious. When her roommate found her bed the next morning, it was soaked with blood, but Linda was gone. Ted had carefully made the bed after the attack and taken her nightgown and pillowcase. Her skull was later found at his Taylor Mountain dump site. He later confessed to assaulting and murdering her, describing it in sickening detail and how he had kept her head as a trophy. March 12th, Donna Gail Manson, age 19, disappeared from Evergreen State College while walking to a jazz concert. She was never seen again. Ted claimed he left her body at Taylor Mountain, but it was never found. It was blamed on animals scattering. April 17th, Susan Elaine Rancourt, age 19, vanished from Central Washington State College. Witnesses saw her talking to a man with his arm in a sling, asking for help carrying books to his car. Sound familiar? Her skull was later recovered at the Taylor Mountain, Mass. gravesite in 1975. May 6th. Roberta Kathleen Parks, age 22, disappeared from Oregon State University. Ted later confessed that he used his fake cast routine on her too. Her skull was later found at Taylor Mountain. June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, age 22, last seen leaving the Flame Tavern in Burn after dancing and drinking. She left with a man who matched Ted's description. Her skull was another one found at Taylor Mountain. Georgianne Hawkins, age 18, on June 11th, was abducted from an alley behind her sorority house at the University of Washington. She was walking about 90 feet from her dorm when she vanished. Multiple witnesses heard her talking to someone, but she never made it inside. Yeah, her remains were later found at the Issaquah site. July 14th, the Shaman-ish murders. This is when Ted got cocky as hell. In broad daylight, at a crowded state park, he abducted 2 women within hours of each other. First was Janice Ann Ott, age 23, who was sunbathing when a man calling himself Ted with his arm in a sling asked for help unloading a sailboat. Witnesses heard the whole conversation hours later. He grabbed Denise Marie Naslund, age 19, using the same routine. He got so confident, he used his real name and pulled this shit on dozens of people. In August, Ted moved to Salt Lake City for law school, and like a plague, the murders followed him. Now, let's go back for a minute to the camping trips that he took his little brother on. Do you see what I see in this? Yeah, how close was he camping to either one of those sites, and how big a thrill was it for him to involve his little brother in his twisted little game? Between 74 and 75, the Utah murders. Once Ted got to Utah, he refined his methods and got even more brutal. On October 1st, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared from Halliday, Utah. Ted later confessed, but her body was never found. October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, age 17, the daughter of a police chief, vanished from Midville, Utah. Her nude body was found 9 days later in the mountains. Ted described in horrific detail how he kept her alive for days, repeatedly assaulting her before finally strangling her. Then he admitted to returning to her body multiple times for his personal satisfaction. On Halloween night, Laura Ann Aim, age 17, disappeared after leaving a Halloween party in Lehi, Utah. Her nude body was found on Thanksgiving Day. Ted later bragged about the sick rituals he performed on her passed away body, washing her hair, applying makeup, and posing her like a doll. November 8th, that same year, 74, this is the day that started Ted's downfall. Carol Duranch, age 18, was shopping at a mall in Murray, Utah, when a man claiming to be a police officer told her that someone had tried to break into her car. She went with him to file a report, but when he tried to handcuff her in his Volkswagen, she fought like hell and escaped. Thank God for her bravery. She lived on to identify and testify against him. That same night, 17-year-old Deborah Jean Kent disappeared from a high school theater in Bountiful, Utah. Her remains weren't identified until 2015 through DNA testing. Well, 1975, the walls start closing in. August 16th, Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward spotted Ted cruising around a residential neighborhood at 2:30 a.m. and tried to pull him over. Well, Ted took off, leading on a chase before finally stopping. When Hayward searched the car, he found a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, and ice pick pantyhose with eye holes cut out. Ted claimed that they were burglary tools, but it seems that Officer Hayward knew better. The forensic teams went to work on Ted's Volkswagen and found hair samples that matched several of his victims. Well, his little put-on was starting to crumble. Between 76 and 77, his conviction and escape. Y'all heard of this. He escaped a couple of times out of jail. March 1st, 76. Ted was convicted of kidnapping Carol Duranch and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But this narcissistic little bastard wasn't having none of that. He wasn't going out without a fight. June 7th of 77. During a court hearing in Aspen, Colorado, Ted jumped out of a second-story window and escaped. He wasn't recaptured until 8 days later, but that showed officials just how desperate and dangerous he was becoming. December 30th of 77. Ted escaped again, this time from his jail cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He squeezed through a hole that he'd cut in the ceiling and made his way to Florida. And y'all, this is where things get ugly. In 1978, while he was on the run from the law, The Florida massacre occurred. January 8th, Ted arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, and rented a room near the Florida State University. He was broke, desperate, and more dangerous than ever. Now, January 15th, around 2:45 a.m., yeah, he was a late-night person, Ted broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, armed with an oak log. Yeah, he brought a log with him. In less than 15 minutes, he committed some of the most brutal murders of his entire career. He bludgeoned and strangled Margaret Elizabeth Bowman, age 21, in her bed. Then he attacked Lisa Janet Levy, age 20, beaten her unconscious, strangling her with pantyhose, and assaulting her with a hairspray bottle. He bit her left butt cheek so hard it left a clear impression of his teeth, evidence that would later convict him. In another room, he attacked Carrie Kleiner and Karen Chandler in the same place at the same piece of wood, breaking their jaws and crushing bones. Both women survived, but just barely. After fleeing the sorority house, Ted wasn't done. He broke into another apartment and attacked Cheryl Thomas, beating her so severely she suffered permanent hearing loss and a few other disabilities. February 9th, Ted's final victim. Then this will break your heart, y'all. If it don't break your heart, you don't have one. This was 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach, who he kidnapped from her school in Lake City, Florida. Her little body was found weeks later in a state park. This was his youngest victim, and it showed just how low he had sunk. February 15th, his killing spree finally ended when Pensacola police officer David Lee stopped him for driving a stolen orange Volkswagen near the Alabama state line. After a brief chase and a struggle, Ted was in custody. When the officer cuffed him, Ted said, "I wish you had killed me." Even then he knew that his series of terror was over. This was the end of one of the most brutal killing sprees in history. In less than 5 years, this monster had murdered 30 women and girls across multiple states, leaving behind a trail of devastated families, traumatized communities, and fear on university campuses. February 10th, 1980. His trial for Kimberly Leach's murder. Ted actually proposed and married Carol Ann Boone right there in court. Okay. On October 24th, 1981, Carol gave birth to Ted's daughter Rose. Now, how she got pregnant while Ted was on death row is kind of a mystery, but to hear her tell it, the guards just kind of turned their back and let them have their moment. Oh, yeah. In 1986, Carol divorced Ted and disappeared with their daughter. They changed their names and just faded away from public eye. Yeah, they don't want to be involved in this. I don't know why she did it in the first place, but people grow up, and it sounds like she did. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair in Florida. Before his death, he had confessed to 30 homicides, although the real number is probably much higher. Officials say that their guesstimate is probably over 100. His mother, Louise, his last words to him were, "You will always be my precious son." Even after all he had done, his mother still loved him. And here's the thing, when Ted was about to fry, he seemed to tell the truth. He gave up burial locations, confessed to murders nobody knew about. He discussed his crimes using third-person narratives. He was separating himself from what he had done, and he provided details and methods. So That's his timeline, folks. From a bastard child in Vermont to a monster in an electric chair, Ted Bundy had earned every single one of those 2,000 volts. And let me leave you with some of his own words. Bundy stated, "I don't feel guilty for anything. I feel sorry for people who feel guilt." He also stated, when you feel the last bit of breath leaving their body and you are looking into their eyes, a person in that situation is God. Thank y'all for tuning in. I will see y'all next week. Sweet dreams.